I invite you to come way back in history with me, about 400 years before Jesus was born. The year is actually 399 BCE, and we are in Athens, Greece, and there is a Greek philosopher on trial, and his name is Socrates. Socrates was a man who liked to live simply and think deeply, and he challenged his students to question everything, and that's where we get the Socratic method. He thought that if we questioned everything, if we were curious about everything, that would stimulate critical thinking, and we would be able to make better decisions, and our life would improve. And so he encouraged his students to question the religious beliefs that they inherited from their families. That system, the pantheon of Greek gods. Now, Socrates believed in God. He just questioned the nature and the existence of all of those Greek gods and all of those statues that we find in the city of Athens. And he invited his students to do the same thing. And that questioning that Socrates was so fond of is what got him arrested. He was arrested and taken to Mars Hill, which is the Areopagus that Polly mentioned a moment ago. It was the seat of their Supreme Court. And Socrates stood in that very place and listened to his accusers bring the accusations against him. The charges were that he was corrupting the youth and that he was being disrespectful to their gods. He was inviting this other idea of God. God as a larger being and not these idols of wood and stone, and not those stories of the Greek mythological gods. And as he heard these charges coming at him, Socrates did not defend himself at all. Instead, he asked questions. He was always the observer, always the listener, always trying to understand the process. So he never defended himself at all. And meanwhile, 501 persons served on the jury. That's a lot of people on a jury. And they watched, observed, listened to the whole thing as Socrates' life hung in the balance. Today in our reading, 450 years after the trial of Socrates, we see the very same thing play out. Paul is doing the same thing in the same place. And his life may very well hang in the balance. Now, some scholars suggest that our reading today is a replay of the trial of Socrates, and I tend to agree with them. We are reading from the book of Acts, and for those of you who are not really familiar with this, it is the second part of the Gospel of Luke. The same person wrote both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. It continues, and it features in the book of Acts this person named Paul, who originally persecutes the Christians, the followers of the way, and then eventually becomes a follower of the way and begins to evangelize all over. So let's talk about Paul just for a moment. In the beginning of the book of Acts, his name is, anybody remember? Saul, which is just the Aramaic version of the Roman name Paul. So if you thought he had a big name change, he did not. It's the same name. The big change he had was a change of heart when he encountered the resurrected Christ on the road and was converted from one who persecuted to one who evangelized. Now, Paul makes, in the book of Acts, he makes 3 missionary journeys. And our reading today is the second of those journeys. And I want you to appreciate how much Paul traveled. He traveled, scholars suggest, 10,000 miles, mostly by foot. And if you wanted some context for what that looks like today, if you started in New York City and you walked all the way to Los Angeles and back twice, that's how far Paul traveled in his missionary journeys in the book of Acts. That's a lot of miles and a lot of steps. Now, Paul had a message of good news, a message of resurrection that he had to share. He was so inspired to share that message that sometimes he was a little overbearing. So just before our reading that Polly shared with us this morning, Paul has been run out of town 2 times. He's gone into 2 different cities, and he's really laid on the Jewish synagogue leaders about Jesus. He is absolutely sure that Jesus is the Messiah. We need to believe in Jesus because the kingdom of God is coming any minute, and we need to be ready. We need to be prepared to welcome the kingdom of God because everything is going to be changed. Now, Paul always went first to the synagogue because he was a Jewish Pharisee. So he went where the people were that understood him, and he would understand them, and he would make the case for Jesus. And in these 2 towns, he maybe was a little overbearing because he caused a riot in both places, and they rose up and they ran him out of town, and he barely escapes with his life. And then we start our reading today when Paul is in Athens, Greece, and we hope maybe Paul has learned a little bit about being chased out of town twice, and he does things just a little bit more gently. He still goes in Athens to the synagogue, and he talks to the religious leaders there, and our reading said he argues, he debates with them, but he doesn't cause any riots. He doesn't get run out of town. So maybe he softened his approach a little. But then he does something really important. He goes into the marketplace and he talks to people. He watches. He listens. He looks at all of the idols, all of the statues. And as a Jewish Pharisee, this hurts his heart. He knows that there are to be no graven images. And here they are all over Athens. And it bothers him. And then he finds one statue that says it is to an unknown God, and he realizes he has a point of connection with the people of Athens that he did not have before. Now, apparently he talks enough so that he doesn't get arrested, but he gets taken to Mars Hill, the judicial seat of Athens. Some scholars say he probably was arrested, but our text doesn't say that. He's invited to the very same place that Socrates stood 450 years before, and Paul begins to speak. Now, if you were reading Luke's Gospel and the book of Acts for the first time in that lifetime, in that century, you would be on pins and needles hearing that reading today, because you would know what happened to Socrates and probably many others who introduced the idea of a different God. And you're waiting to see if Paul is even going to get out of this alive. Now, I didn't understand that until I found out that this is the exact same place where Socrates' trial took place. And that I would have read this and not thought anything about any danger for Paul. But there is a significant amount of danger here. He begins with just a little bit of genius. He has learned something, our Paul. My admiration for him has gone up just a half a notch. He has not been my best friend, just letting you know. Paul starts with a compliment. I see you are all extremely religious. Oh, the people of Athens love that. They do love their gods. They love their worship. It's just an integral part of who they are as a people. And then he says, I've even observed the statue to an unknown God, and I know who that God is. Now he's got them eating out of the palm of his hand. They can't wait to hear, oh, who is this God, the one that is unknown to us? So now they're listening, and Paul begins to tell them about God, the God of the Hebrew people, the God who is larger than everything. In him we live and move and have our being. This is a God that is all-encompassing. This is the God who created the world and sustains life and even has the power to resurrect. Now, I want you to think for a moment about what is missing from Paul's good news that he shares with the people of Athens. Because what he does not talk about is Jesus. Jesus isn't in here. Don't you think that's a bit of a big omission? He does not talk the standard Christianese that we all talk. He doesn't use the word Jesus. He doesn't use the word sin. He doesn't use or make any reference to the Hebrew prophets. He doesn't do any of the things that we would expect him to do if he's sharing the good news about Jesus. But he shares what he knows the people of Athens need to hear. And he's careful not to share too much because he doesn't need to be run out of another town. Paul, most scholars agree, was not arrested because he's allowed to leave. Socrates was not allowed to leave. That 501-person jury voted by a majority of only 59 that he was guilty of corrupting the youth and introducing foreign gods and disrespecting the gods of Greece. And he was condemned to death. He had to drink poisoned hemlock. And Socrates maintained his sense of humor, of well-being, and asked questions. Death was going to be just another process for him to observe, and he maintained his equanimity until the very end. But he died for his beliefs. Paul does not. Paul gets to walk away from Mars Hill after he has made his case for an unknown God. And he allows everyone who's heard his message to make up their own minds. What do they believe and why? Now today, people everywhere are making up their own minds about church and about faith and about religion. Every Sunday, somewhere in the United States, 1,000 people under the age of about 29 leave church and say, that was it. I'm never going back. This is Gen Z that I'm talking about. Folks who were born between 2012, 1997 and 2012. And they are leaving churches or have already left at an alarming rate. And it is changing the face of church and our worship. And many churches, about 4,000 a year, are closing their doors, not because of any mismanagement of funds, not because they're bad churches. They're just closing because there are no people to replace those who are passing away. The median age now of our churches is 60. Now, according to some research by Ryan Burge, who wrote a book called The Vanishing Church, which is on my read list for my vacation, and Tony Jones, they've done some work on the nuns, the folks who check the box that says no religious affiliation, and Gen Z, which largely has exited the building and don't seem to be inclined to come back. And what they found is that Gen Z not only has left church, but wants to talk about it. They post on social media all the time. If you look up the hashtag, why I left church, thousands of posts will come up. People having conversations. There was one back in 2021 that went viral, and all it was a 23-year-old young woman named Sarah who titled her video, Why I Left Church. It was 60 seconds long, and so many people watched it. I mean, millions of views of this video, and then hundreds and thousands of comments. And now you can type in why I left church, and it is a whole topic of discussion. Gen Z wants to talk about it. It is at least a little bit important to them. And the range of reasons why they left, I mean, it's huge. A lot of it was they were abused or hurt by somebody in the church. They needed help and they were not welcomed. They were already scraping, trying to pay $32,000 in student loan debt, which is the average. And the church was asking for more money to build another addition or to do something else. And they felt a real disconnect. In 2016, there was a big exodus from the evangelical church over political views. All of those are encompassing. And Gen Z has largely left the building. Now imagine if you were Paul and Gen Z was Athens. What would you do? Wouldn't you go out like Paul did into the marketplace? Wouldn't you get on social media? Wouldn't you talk to some of them and see what is important to them? Then there's that whole different category, the nuns. And the research from Jones and Burge on this is really pretty interesting. It's not as comprehensive as I would like, but it's being studied, so that's important. But from the folks that say they have no religious affiliation whatsoever. There are three main groups. One of them is the spiritual but not religious folks. You've heard that phrase before, right? What Burge and Jones found is that that group alone makes up 40% of the nuns. They say they're spiritual but not religious. They feel spiritual. They believe something spiritual, but they actually have no practice. They don't pray. They don't attend a church, a mosque, a synagogue. They don't do yoga. They don't meditate. They say they're spiritual. They want to be spiritual, but they really don't practice at all. Then there's another 30% that I find really fascinating too. We all as Christians assume that everybody who's not connected with a church has this God-shaped hole in their soul and they're miserable and filled with anxiety and they're sad. 30% of the nuns are doing great. They don't feel like they need God or church. They are living their lives. They're trying to be good people. They are connected in their communities. They have good friend groups, supportive families. They're doing fine. They would not be interested. And then there's this other 20%, and this is the one I want us to pay attention to the most. These are folks that check the nun box. We are not affiliated to any religious group, but this is 20 million people who pray every day. They pray every day, but they don't have a place where they belong. They don't feel like they can connect. They don't feel welcome, and so they stay home. Now, if we were Paul, that would be a mission field, would it not? There's 20 million people out there who pray every day. Now, I want us to think for a moment using the Socratic method. Why don't we do that? Let's just ask some questions. What does Gen Z and these 20 million people who pray every day, what's important to them? What do they think about? What matters to them? Do we know? How do we find out? And then my next question for you is, if you were going to share the good news with them, what would you even say? Paul shared good news without even saying the name of Jesus. What is our good news? If we actually are a congregation that asks questions and allows everybody to ask questions, and we don't dole out the answers, but we ask you to wrestle with it yourself, figure out what is true for you, what is our good news then? Should we have a collective idea of what that is? Or do we each have something we would say? Imagine for a moment that you are sitting beside a 16-year-old who says, "This is so boring. Why should I sit here?" What would you say? Have you thought about it? Okay, so the first thing was, what concerns them? What is important to them? Their phones, right? Because they're all walking around like this with their phones. I do the same thing. It's infected me too. Imagine that their phones are like the idols that Paul saw in Athens. They're everywhere. Everybody's worshiping the idols. Everybody's worshiping their phones. What can we do to connect with people who do that? They're not going to come here at 10 o'clock on a Sunday. But maybe there are other things we can do. Now, one more question, and this is important. Well, they're all important, but this one. Why do we want to invite them to church? Why do we want to invite Gen Z to come to church? Why do we want to invite the 20 million people who pray every day but don't have a place where they belong? Why do we want to invite them here? Is it because we need to prop up our institution, otherwise it's going to close? Because if we are inviting people here so that we can prop up the church, we will fail, because Gen Z is not having that. That can never be our reason. And if it is, that is very unchristian, because Christianity has never been about propping up an institution. What is it about? Oh, that's that other question I asked you about what's the good news you're going to share. For Paul, it was about resurrection. The only thing he finally said was that this God who creates and sustains also resurrects. And at that moment, he lost part of his audience. A whole group of people said, "Oh, that's ridiculous." And they made fun of Paul and they walked off. They said, "We've heard enough." But another group said, "Well, wait a minute. We need to hear more on this topic. We need to discuss this more." And just a few others said, "This sounds right to me." And they believed. So whenever we share the good news with somebody, we face those three possible responses. They might believe, they might question, and they might just walk away and say, "Forget it," right? But Paul felt like that was all he had to do in Athens. So what is it that we have to do now? And it cannot be to prop up the institution, because we've got these choices. Socrates died, and he went out with great humility and grace. And Paul changed. He changed his delivery. And I think those are the two choices we have before us. We either die or we change. And the change has got to be pretty significant. And it cannot be ever to support or extend the life of a church, because the church is evolving, and Gen Z and those that follow them are going to create something that is their own. And so we need to help them. But we don't know how yet. So all I want you to think about now, I know I've left a lot of questions hanging around, but hey, it's Socratic Method Day, so, questions are what it's about. What I want you to do is think about what this church would look like if every empty space had somebody from the Gen Z age group in it, 16 to 29, and they're all on their phones. Is that what you want? First of all, be honest. Is that what you want? But if you were sitting beside someone who said, "Why? What is church even about? What good is it? Why do you go? Why should I go?" What will you say? What is your good news?